So, some backstory. My family has a couple friends that follow us no matter where we go. One used to sing to me when I was a baby, and another woke my mom up in time to realize my 1 year old sister, now 8, had an extremely high fever and to take her to the hospital at 3 a.m. The woman, the one who used to sing to me, tends to wander, but mainly watches my mom sleep. She looks exactly like my mom. We're pretty sure it's my mom's twin that my grandmother is sure she lost. The man tends to either hang out at my bedroom door when I'm sleeping or wander as well. He's the one that wakes up in emergencies. Mom said he sounds like my great grandfather. Now, all that has led to a series of activities from them, moving stuff, taking stuff that actually results in having to ask for it back politely, and stumbling across it in a very obvious place, like on the stove. Empty tables, or literally stepping on it in the middle of the floor. It was around 11:45 p.m. when I hopped in the shower. I'm a night owl. And when I got out, I was about to wipe the mirror off when I paused and noticed a handprint on the fogged up glass. I thought it was mine from earlier or something, but I looked closer and it didn't look right. So I put a handprint in the same position next to it and, well, my hand is bigger. It couldn't have been my sister because she'd been asleep for hours by that point and it was way too high up. So yeah. Then I got to my mom and tell her about the handprint. She then tells me that when I was in the shower, something moved a box in the garage with a very loud, distinct sliding noise. Her office is in the garage. She was going to call me, but she left her phone in the house, so she just quietly went back to her game. Then, fast forward to about 40 minutes ago. I was upstairs, said goodnight to my mom, turned off her lamp, and walked out. As I was passing my sister's room, something whispering next to me made me freeze. I don't know what it said, but I think it was the end of my name, but it's a common sound, so it could have been anything. But I glanced in a room and saw a figure shift from the middle of the room. I turned away casually and walked to the stairs. My room is in the basement, and so is my roommate, who was also a family friend. You know those moments when you know something going on behind you, but you don't dare to look back? Well, I know she followed me until I reached the living room, then watched as I went downstairs. I know for a fact it was the woman. It was the same feeling. I also know that they've been with us longer than I've been alive and tend to help us and never hurt my family. Hence, why we call them our friends. This house was eerily quiet until about 2 minutes ago. Our friends have been inactive for a couple of months, and they do that sometimes. But wow, they really like us to know when they're back. This happened the first week of January 1993, and it's forever burned in my memory. My mom works 12-hour shifts overnight at a cotton mill. So much of the time I was on my own. I was 18, having graduated that past May. I was kind of taking a gap year before I started college. I had slept most of the day because I had come off of a particularly scary trip to and from Texas. That's another story for another time. She woke me long enough to ask my plans for the night. I told her I was going to my now ex-boyfriend's house. She told me to be careful and left. A few hours later, I get ready to walk out the door. It's very dark out. The porch light was out. I grab a flashlight, open the door, and there's a car I don't recognize parked in front of my house. A guy steps out and just shakes his head no. He stands there looking at me. I also noticed my dog Rusty was not barking and carrying on like normal when a stranger is near. I quickly go back in the house and lock the door. I'm looking out the front window and he's just sitting in his car. About 20 minutes pass and I hear the car crank up. I'm thinking once he leaves, I'll make a run for my car and go. Nope. He pulls into the Mormon church parking lot across from my house, shines the headlights right at my house, flashes them a few times, and then turns them off. Great, I thought. I'm trapped now. Another 30 minutes go by, him sitting there and me watching out the front window. Finally, he cranks up and leaves in the opposite entrance of the parking lot. There were 2 ways into that lot. He disappears. I wait another 10 minutes before I actually leave. I go my usual route to the busy highway I have to cross. There was a wreck, so I detoured to the gas station to grab a drink. I see one of my cop friends there, and we start talking. An 18-wheeler with a drunk driver had run the light about an hour ago and killed a woman. He said all the colour had drained from my face, like I'd seen a ghost. He asked what was wrong. So I relayed the story back to him of what I'd been through in the last hour. He asked if it was the psycho that had been stalking me for the last year and a half. Nope, this guy was too tall to be him. So he got out his notepad and got his description and his car description. He told me he'd check it out, due to being stalked. Before I left, he stopped me and said, sometimes our guardian angel will do that, what they have to do in order to save a life. You were supposed to be at that red light at that particular time, but you were saved for a reason. I cried all the way to my boyfriend's house. I learned later she was a nurse and had just gotten off of her shift. She was a single mom, just like my mom, and she was killed instantly. A few weeks later, my cop friend told me and others who knew me had done some checking in their free time to find the car and guy. He said none of the descriptions matched up. It was like it vanished into thin air. I carried survivor guilt for a long time. I got into the medical field and became an EMT. A little background for this one. I was raised by my mum's sisters, brothers, and 2 brothers-in-law. I came from a firefighter/EMT medic family. One particular aunt and uncle were on the FD together. My uncle was fire chief in EMT, and my aunt was a nurse in EMT, so it was really nothing to see me on scenes with them. My uncle died in 1997. He had a heart attack after a structure fire. Some years later, my hubby's best friend talked him into joining the local FD with him. He did. He loved it. I joined also, starting out with the auxiliary, eventually going on to be operational. We were a team, like my aunt and uncle. Our son, as well as best friends and brothers, also joined. One night, they had a nasty structural fire call. I couldn't go because I had a sick kid. So I stayed home and babysat the scanner. When the chief said to switch to TAC 1 channel, I switched too. Hubby and best friend were first in the door with the hose. Our son and one of the brothers were on backup at the door. All of a sudden, I hear hubby say, "We gotta go! Get out now! Go, go, go!" Just as they hit the door, the roof collapsed where they were standing. I do believe I held my breath until I heard the accountability call. Hubby said their engine number times 4. They switched to a surround and drown tactic then. They came home and hubby was telling me what had happened. He kept hearing a voice in his head telling him to get out of the house. He said the voice was unfamiliar to him. I looked at him and said, "Dude, my Uncle D just saved your lives." He looked at me and asked, "You really think so?" His buddy was a skeptic at the time. I did make a believer out of him eventually. He saw the crazy paranormal stuff that goes on at my house and in my life. We lost him in 2012, so he's now become part of that crazy paranormal stuff. For the last few weeks, my hubby and the crew have been working on a new house, which is still under construction. I have been on the house several times doing my boss wife duty. They hung and finished the drywall throughout this huge monstrosity. He called on Sunday for me to go over there to find one of his squares for another job they had started. I loaded up my granddaughter and off we went. This house is way off in a rural area of the county, next to the one I live in, big time boonies. I'm very sensitive to spirits and other paranormal activity. I had gotten bad vibes from that house every time I went there. No worries. When I went, the crew and other workers were there. This time, it was going to be just me and my granddaughter. Luckily, she fell asleep in the Jeep on the way over. She did wake up when we got there. I told her to stay put, and she did. I've been in countless new constructions in the 25 plus years we've owned our business. None have ever put me on edge like this one has. I did a walkthrough of the first floor. I heard the house settling. Okay, no worries. That's what the noise was. If you've ever been in a new house like that before, footsteps on subflooring have a distinctive sound, and there's an echo. I heard a second set of footsteps. I stood still for a few minutes, and I still heard it. I knew it wasn't the monkey bug. She's only 5 years old. These sounded like grown-up footsteps. I had to go check the attic room. As I was going up the stairs, I heard a loud bang, like a tool or something had been dropped. After a second walk through the first floor, I called the hubby on FaceTime. He told me to go back up to the attic room. Oh joy, I'm terrified of heights. So back up I went, and found the square behind some window screens. It wasn't there when I checked the first time. I grabbed it and made a beeline for the door. I felt like I was being watched by something ominous the entire time. That's a feeling I know all too well. Later that night, I let him know I will not go back to that house ever by myself. I explained why. Bad juju and vibes from that property. He said to me, if anyone would know that, it would be you. I live in Alabama. I swear every square inch of this state is haunted in some way. I'm a firm believer in that we are put where we are needed, or when we need help. I've been on both sides. I'm the kind of person that will help and talk to anyone. I've had paranormal experiences my whole life. One of my aunts who helped raise me called me a satellite for the spirit world. My friends call me a ghost magnet. A little background for this story. My mum and her 3 sisters have all passed. Between May 2016 to May 2017, I lost my mum, one of my granddaughters, and one of my mum's older brothers. I always know which one is around me because of their scent. You know, that familiar scent, whether it's their perfume or maybe favourite candy or food. See where I'm going with this? I've been smelling my mum's scent all day. I knew she was with me. Anyway, the week before Christmas, my hubby got the flu. I went to babysit my youngest granddaughter, and afterwards, I was going to the grocery store to pick up stuff to make him homemade chicken soup. Well, that's when I met Mrs. Matty. The holidays are just not the same anymore, and I was trying so hard not to cry. I'm also the person who never shows on the outside what's going on the inside. I saw my favourite water was on sale, and she was looking at it also. I asked her if she wanted me to put it in her buggy for her. I saw she had a cane. She said no, she'd get it later. I put 2 cases in my buggy. She reprimanded me for picking up such heavy things. I told her it was no problem. She let me know she'd seen me limping. I explained it's nothing really. The sciatic nerve was acting up, thanks to a back injury. She then looked at me and asked if I really was okay. It was like she could see through the smile and knew I was feeling down. We got to talking like we were old friends. She's 83 years old. I swear she didn't look a day over 60. I told her for the last month I'd been on the go, taking care of everyone and everything. I'd literally put 1,000 miles on my Jeep. She said I sound like her. She's the main caregiver for her hubby. He has Alzheimer's and a daughter who's bedridden due to a stroke. She took hold of both of my hands and said, "Baby, I see a bright light around you. You have a good heart. You remind me of my best friend, who'd passed the week before. Something told her to come to this store today, and not the other one in our small town." Her best friend was white, she's of colour, and I really reminded her of her friend. Not only that, she reminded me of one of my aunts. I ended up telling her about my mum, granddaughter, and aunt. She hugged me so tight that at that moment, I almost started crying. She said talking to me was what she needed at the time, and that we were meant to meet that day. I felt like I was the one who needed her that day. We also learned we live kind of close to each other too. She said, "We're friends now, and I love you." I know in my heart I'll see you again. She said to always keep my bright and shining light I have around me. It's like I have angels with me. She hugged me again, and we went on our way. 2 days later, I was back at the same store, making more soup for the sick hubby, when all of a sudden, Mrs. Matty comes walking around a corner. I squealed in happiness, and she grabbed me and hugged me. She asked how the soup turned out, and I told her I was here to get ingredients to make more. My hubby loved it. He won't eat the canned stuff anymore. She said she almost went to the other store again, but a voice told her to come to this one. She then went into aunt mode. Have you been resting your back and leg, taking care of yourself? I told her that I had. She said she went home that day we met and told her whole family about me, the sweet girl who made her feel better. I told her she helped me that day, that our loved ones put us together for a reason. I do believe that. People come into our lives when we need them the most. We met Pop sometime in 1999, when he started staying with our POS friend, and now ex-wife. Pop was on disability, former Navy, had diabetes, and needed a double lung transplant. He was also an old school sheetrock man, like from back in the beginning, like my stepfather-in-law. Hubby learned from stepfather-in-law, so we own a sheetrock and construction business. When Hubby learned of this, he invited Pop to come to work with him. Give him something to do during the day. They clicked right away. He was old, set in his ways, and stubborn as hell. In the beginning of 2000, Hubby and I had split up for a few weeks. It was all BS. The kids and I went into hiding because of a dirty cop and CPS threats. During these few weeks, Hubby learned how he was being treated. He didn't like it at all. He called me and let me know what was going on. He said he was going to go get him. He was bringing him home. Pop didn't hesitate to grab his things, which wasn't much, and come home with Hubby. His own family disowned him. He saw what Hubby was going through, being separated from us, but Pop kept saying, "Don't worry, son. Our girl is coming home. She's been cautious. She'll be home soon." He said this was because we reminded him of him and his third wife, the love of his life. The day I decided to come back out of hiding, I told no one but my mom and my aunt. I knew where they were working, so I made the over 2.5-hour trip. Hubby told me Pop kept looking out the window. He asked Pop what he was doing. Pop told him, "Today's the day. Our girl's coming home for good." I pulled up at the job site and Pop called him to the window. "See, I told you, she was coming home." How Pop knew, I'll never know. He and I had a crazy connection, as he did with my hubby. They loaded up the work van, and we headed home. We live in rural Alabama, close to the Cahaba River. Every year around Mother's Day, the river lilies start to bloom. Every year, he and his third wife would go and see them. They'd hang out and fish. He loved being on that river. He and our son would go camp there on the weekends. Well, that turned into a family thing for us. He had always talked about going camping. So we went and bought all the camp equipment we needed. When we do something, we're a go big or go home kind of people. We still camp, the hubby and I, to this day. I took over his medical care. Doctor's appointments. I was there in the room with him. The doctor asked him once if he was taking his meds and checking his sugar levels. He said right in front of me, "My granddaughter's doing all that. It's like living full time with a Marine drill sergeant. If she says do it, well, you better do it. She knows what she's doing." Pop would tell everyone that he had finally found his granddaughter. He'd go on and on about the kids. He asked me once if we were related. He even asked my mom when she came to visit. He'd tell me when we would talk, there was something otherworldly about me. I'd joke about how I'm the granddaughter of the witch they couldn't burn. He would laugh and said he believed it. In the fall of 2000, he started going downhill quickly. Dementia was starting to set in, so he couldn't go to work with my hubby. I had to call rescue out a few times, but he refused transport to the hospital, saying I could take care of him. His faith in me was overwhelming at times. So one day in December, it was just Pop, our youngest at the time, Boo Buggy, and I at the house. Everything seemed fine. Boo Buggy told him they were going to watch 101 Dalmatians. He said, okay, that's our morning movie today. They both settled on the couch next to each other. Like I said, nothing seemed out of place. He was in his right mind, a normal day. Sometime a bit later, he said he was tired and was going to take a nap. Not long after, Boo Buggy came into the kitchen and said, Mama, Papa fell over. I ran to check on him. There was no pulse. I got him to the floor and started CPR. I had no phone at the time, so I grabbed Boo Buggy and ran to the neighbour's house to get them to call. Her hubby came back to my house and she kept Boo Buggy. We started CPR again and rescue showed up. It was too late. He was gone. The medical examiner told me there was nothing that could be done. It was a pulmonary embolism. We still go camping, and I know he tags along with us. After we passed, I would hear footsteps in the trailer at night. He'd check on the kids, and he'd get up to use the bathroom or something. Even after we moved into the new house, I would hear footsteps going from room to room. I knew it wasn't the kids. Each one had a distinct one. I'd get up to check. There he was, going from room to room. I invited him to continue to live with us as long as he wanted. We now have him, plus a few other family members and friends who have passed living with us. I could go on forever about how he was an amazing man and grandpa. His antics haven't stopped either, still keeping me on my toes. This happened years ago, when I was about 12 or 13. My cousin would come stay with my family over the summer every year. This particular night, I remember her and I choosing to sleep in my living room, while my sister stayed in our shared bedroom. I'd already fallen asleep when all of this happened, so it's all from my family's accounts of the situation. Basically, I was sleeping on one couch, and my cousin was up on her iPod on the couch across the living room, which she said she saw a full black figure, like a shadow of a man, come across from the hallway and stand at the foot of the couch I was laying on. Mind you, it was dark in the house with just a couple lights coming from the kitchen and a nightlight in the bathroom. She said it just stood there staring down at me, not moving at all, and she assumed it was my stepdad. And to see what he wanted, she called out his name. And when she said this, my stepdad stepped out of the kitchen, more on the side of where she was laying, and he was like, yeah? And that freaked her out, and she just faced the other way without saying anything or looking back at me. The next morning, my whole family was in the dining room, talking and eating, and she told us what she saw the night before, which freaked me out, knowing it was looking at me sleeping. And my mom started to get really worked up. I guess the same night my mom was laying in her bed and felt someone tapping her feet, and saw the top of her head peeking over the bed. Thinking it was my little sister trying to come lay with her, she called her name and told her to come to bed. When she did this, the figure crawled from the foot of the bed to the side, where my mom laid and just stayed crouched on the floor. When my mom sat up to look over on the floor, there was no one there, which scared her, and we just went to sleep. My little sister said she stayed in the room all night and just slept throughout the night. Everything felt odd in that apartment after that night. I was so scared things were watching me. Sleep after that. I'm pretty sure the ghost of a cat I lost to a range of issues with his innards in 2017 is patrolling my home. A few weeks back, I'm watching TV. The door to the room I was in was propped open to allow my two cats to come and go. The hallway outside is lit up, so I can see the cats come and go. All is quiet. Then I see a cat pass by the door out of the corner of my eye. I thought nothing of it until I realised both of my cats were in the room with me. One curled up on the sofa beside me, and the other on his high perch, both sound asleep. Then, not long after that, I'm in bed, just about dozing off to sleep, when I feel the unmistakable footfall of a cat patrolling the foot of the bed. on the mattress, atop my duvet. But both my cats are curled up by my chest, one either side. This is something the deceased can always do. He'd patrol up and down the bed a few times before settling in. A few days later, I'm reading a book in bed with both of my cats cuddled into each other beside me. Suddenly, the younger cat lets out this almighty spit. The kind of spit a cat hisses out when it's defending itself. Not a gentle hiss, but a sharp, guttural spat. As he does this, he bolts. And just last night, I'm sitting at the PC doing a last-minute email before shutting down. I felt something touch my foot. Nothing unusual about that, I thought. Loki, the younger replacement cat, does this all the time. But wait, he's curled up with Deck, the older cat, littermate to the one I lost in 2017. On the spare chair next to me, both sound asleep. I look down, nothing. No creepy crawler either. A few minutes go by, my feet now tucked under my chair. Suddenly, something furry brushes past them ever so slightly. Both cats are still curled up into each other, on the chair. Ghost cat. This happened over 10 years ago. My brother and I were teenagers at the time. So I was in my room at my computer and the internet stopped working. My brother walked in my room and asked me if the internet was working, because he was also in his room on his computer. I said no. The modem was in my parents' room down the hall, so he goes to restart it. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes. I yelled out to ask him if he fixed it. No answer. I got up and went to his room, which is to the right of my bedroom door. I'm standing in his doorway. His desk is against the wall across from the doorway. I see him sitting there, his back to me. I call out his name and ask why he's not answering me. My brother stands up, not looking at me, and walks toward the bed. His dresser was on the wall by the door, so I couldn't see him. I have to lean in the room. The whole time I'm saying his name, like, what the hell? Why isn't he answering me? I look over at his bed. My brother turns around and disappears right in front of me. I'm literally like, what the fuck? So I ran down the hall to my parents' room. He's not there. Super freaked out, I ran out of there and ran down the stairs. He's not down there either. I come back up the stairs and he comes walking out of my parents' room. So I told him what just happened and it scared the shit out of him. He was too freaked out and wanted me to sleep in his room with him. I did, because I was scared too. He had a couch in his room and that's where I slept that night. There were like one outlet in our bedrooms, so he had an extension cord run under the cushions of the couch to the AC in the window and had a blanket on top. So I brought my pillow and blanket in and fell asleep. I wake up in the morning on the bare couch. All the cushions were on the floor on both blankets and my pillow. I'm a super light sleeper. There's absolutely no way that I did that in my sleep. Does anyone have any idea what happened? Like, how would I see my brother, but it wasn't him? I used to visit my family in Mexico every summer, up until it got really bad to travel when I was about 9. One year, me, my nephew and my parents were staying with my grandpa in his house. He lived in a small ranch that was gated and locked at night. One day, as we were settling into sleep, we heard a knock on the side door, which faced the gated courtyard. At this point, it was nearly 3 a.m. and I panicked, because I was sleeping right next to that door with my 1-year-old nephew on an air mattress, and it was late as fuck. My dad assures me it's probably my uncle who lives next door and has a key to the courtyard. As the knocking stops, my dad opens the door and no one's there. He walks into the courtyard and even checks the restroom, which was connected, but the door was on the outside. My dad rolls his eyes and tells us it's probably my cousin playing tricks on us. He closes the door and 5 minutes later, knock, knock, knock. My dad, with as little patience, opens the door and yells my cousin's name. No one was at the door, and no one responded. He once again walks everywhere, checks every place someone can possibly hide, and checks the restroom. He closed the door, and 5 minutes passed by again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, I was staring at the door, which had foggy yellow glass on it, and I saw a shadow. I told my dad, and he, now actively mad, goes out and walks the courtyard and checks the courtyard locks. Everything is locked, and no one is outside. This happens a couple more times, and I continuously see the shadow of whoever knocks on the door. Sometimes it would seem like a person, and other times it would be a vague shape. We planned to ignore it, but the knocks got more and more aggressive. To the point my dad stood by the door, hand on the doorknob, waiting for the next knock. We see the shadow, and the knock starts again. Knock, and my dad swings open the door mid-knock. No one's there. My dad stood there dumbstruck. There's no way for whoever was knocking to disappear. There's no way for them to hide that quickly. Then my dad quickly shuts the door. Knock, knock. The knock finishes, and the shadow disappears. At that point, we entirely ignored it, and I was told to go to sleep. The knocking continued from 3 to 4 a.m., and I'd stare at the door as the shadow appeared, knocked aggressively, and would leave. At one point, it seemed like the door would shake by how aggressively it would knock. We told my grandpa, and he shrugged and said, just ignore it. Next time, it eventually stops. We still occasionally laugh about it. It's one of our many ghost stories from Mexico. That one is the most vivid to me because it wasn't temporary. That shit seemed to last like forever. This one is from 16 years ago, back when I was around 7 years old. It was a time my parents left with me at my grandma's house in Mexico for 2 days, as they ran errands for my family. I was napping when I heard the distinct sound of pots and pans being moved around. My grandma's door was right next to the dining room, which was connected to the kitchen. And it wasn't a door exactly, but just curtains, so sound goes through very easily. Also, 2 steps out the door, you're in the dining room, and you can see straight into the kitchen via a large mirror. It sounded like something out of a movie, where people pass by a kitchen in a restaurant, and you hear general busy kitchen sounds. And I heard it very clearly and extremely loudly, as I'm a deep sleeper, and it takes a lot for me to wake up. I didn't think anything of it, but my grandma is old, so naturally I called out for her and asked what she was making. There was no response, so I stood to find my shoes and yell again, and nothing. I pulled back the curtain and walked a few steps out the door into the dining room, and the moment my footsteps entered the dining room, the house went completely quiet. Like a complete, unnatural quiet. Usually, you can hear animals and the river that runs through the town, but it was almost deafening. I look through the mirror, and no one is in the kitchen. I turn, not trusting the mirror, and the kitchen remains empty. I remember being frozen and just standing there. It almost sounded like when your ears don't pop right and everything is muffled. Suddenly, I hear the front door and normal sounds start flooding in. The sound of animals and the river as if it had never stopped. My grandma walks through with groceries, and I ask her where she's been. She'd gone out for 30 minutes prior to get groceries for dinner. I was completely alone in the house. I told her what I heard, and she said I must have interrupted the ghost making food and laughed it off. That happened often in that house, however, I always had a way of explaining it, because there were always other people in the house. But that time, I was completely alone. My grandma unfortunately has dementia now, so she doesn't remember this happening, but it's still something that when I think about how quick the sounds stop, like flipping a switch, it scares the living hell out of me, as I've never experienced anything similar. The same day, me and my grandma retired to bed. I decided I really needed to pee late at night, and I sat up, and suddenly she leaned over and grabbed my hand and in a hushed voice said, "Don't disturb them. It's better if you just go back to sleep." My grandma's house is notoriously haunted in my family. Speak to any member of my family and they all have a story about that house. There's also rules of that house. No one goes to the bathroom at night, like no one. And if you do, cover your peripherals and run like hell. My grandma is very aware of the activity as well. This happened to me about a year or two ago. I was sleeping at my boyfriend's mom's house with him. For context, his entire family has many stories of this house. Seeing family members when they weren't actually home, hearing maniacal laughter that only goes away after praying aloud, hearing voices calling their names, the list goes on. I had always gotten a sense of dread when I visited this house, although I'd never personally experienced anything to justify it, until this particular night. In the middle of the night, we were both awoken from a dead sleep by a sound that I can only describe as a demonic scream, in combination with a bear roaring that got deafeningly loud and then slowly faded away. As I woke up, I realized I had a pillow over my face in a defensive position. It was a primal reaction to the fear, like I was preparing to be attacked. At the exact same moment, my boyfriend had sat straight up. We both stayed in a stunned silence for a passing second as we processed what the hell we had just heard. He quietly asked me if I heard that. I confirmed that I did and asked him what it was. He didn't know. We had a cat and a dog in the room with us at the time, and neither had reacted to the sound. His mom did have one other dog that was refusing to come into the room all night, but she's a husky, and they're a bit quirky. No other people were home besides us two. To add insult to injury, we checked the clock and it was exactly 3 a.m. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but it made it even scarier. I've been in car accidents and near car accidents, even survived a tornado. However, I can honestly say I've never been this afraid in my life before. I didn't fall back asleep that entire night, and my heart continued pounding for hours. I'm curious as to what your theories are about this. I think about it a lot, as I feel this is truly the most paranormal experience I've ever had, yet I shared it with my boyfriend. I hear a lot about paranormal experiences being unique to the individual, so it makes me wonder why and how we shared this. My personal theory is that it was an accumulation of negative energy being expressed. I was a freshman in high school. My dad was a pizza delivery man, and I was proud of him because he tried super hard to take care of me, so he worked late sometimes. That's a foreshadow for the future. I remember laying in bed about 11:30 p.m. All of a sudden, I hear a little girl from downstairs. It sounded like a cry that ended in laughter. It lasted for about 3 to 4 seconds. Me not thinking of it, went to go check on Dad, thinking he made that noise. I go up the top of the step and look down at my living room. Pitch black. I looked over and my dad was in his room. I walk in and ask, "Hey, did you hear that?" He says, "I thought that was you." That's how it all began. The next few days it got worse. My dad had severe nightmares. He only told me a few of them, and I'll explain one to you guys. He was held down on his bed. Some dark shape humanoid crawled up to his chest and started screaming. Then many others started screaming around him. He said it got worse after those, but he never wants to speak about them. For a while, I was super hesitant on believing anything was happening. I assumed there was a scientific reason to why things started happening and what we heard. But then, the footsteps above the attic that followed us started going on. Every day. Everywhere we went. Footsteps above us were happening. Even worse, dead bugs were everywhere. I mean, thousands of flies were out at our windows, and we were infested. It was unreal how much there was. But after all of this, I was still not 100% believing. I knew things were going on, but truth be told, I was starting to believe my dad, but I was just too scared to think it was true. Then came the scary part. I was sleeping next to my dad because he had a really bad nightmare, and objects were being thrown at us. Heavy objects. cans of food in particular. Our house was shaped to where our living room was open to our kitchen, and I was on the couch while Dad was on the floor mattress that he laid out next to me. A literal can of vegetables was thrown at me, woke my dad and I up. Then I watched more cans thrown at us. I didn't believe what I was seeing. That was the first time I ever saw Dad start to cry. He prayed out loud for it to stop, pleading to Jesus to end this madness. It calmed down, but we couldn't sleep all night. We were tempted to go sleep in the car, but it was freezing, and decided to take shifts in sleeping. The next day, he went to work and I came home from school. I lived about a 5-minute walk away. I sat down and felt very weird. Almost drained is the best way I could describe it. It felt weird for a while, and when it started getting dark around 6:30 or 7, I knew something was up. And I had YouTube on my Xbox, so I played really loud Christian music. I'm going to try to explain what happens next, but I doubt it will give you guys a good grasp of what happened. Everything went pure silent. I thought I muted the TV by accident, but then I realized I couldn't hear anything. I even tried thumping the couch a few times, and nothing. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of light, but colourful. Heat, but noticeable. It was like it wasn't real, or a part of this world. I felt pain, but not physically yet. But the mental pain was so bad it was almost physical. I remember it was right next to me on my right side. I felt it, I guess, touch me or something, because it was like extreme heat or something was on my arm. I felt something touch my arm, and it didn't feel good, and that was the final straw. I was so drained, so tired, I could barely move. I was so scared and felt hopeless. I picked up my phone and called Dad. He said, "Hey." I said, "Dad, help," in a low voice because I was in shock. He said, "I'm on my way right now." He comes in a few minutes later and picks me up and takes me outside. I tell him what happens and he takes me to my mom's. They were divorced and didn't like each other. I sleep all day from pure exhaustion. The next day, we went to a specialist. My dad knows this guy because he goes to our church. He's really talented, and he's had people come to him for help with situations like we were in. We walk in his office, and he tells us immediately to sit down. He tells us God told him what's going on, and that we need to get out of the house and take our cat and dog out right now. Our cat and dog were shaking and shivering the entire time all of this was happening. Constantly, they would stare at random things in the corner of rooms, and both eyes would race around the room at the same time. It was funny to me when I didn't believe it. But once I knew what was going on, it was frightening. We got the pets out, got some clothes, and went to a hotel. Our pets went to my mom's, which she didn't believe anything we were saying, and she accused my dad of being on drugs. But I told her what happened, and she started believing me. The specialist and 3 others went into our house, and a few days later told us to come in with them. They said it was multiple demons, and that it will be tough to get them out. We followed them as they were praying. They also said to make it look like they were just as guests, because they're smart, and if they know we're trying to get them out, they'll prevent it. So we made food, turned on the TV, talked about sports and such. They started cleaning the house. We took out a lot of random things for very specific reasons that I forget. We cleaned a little too, because our house was a little dirty. Not bad, but they wanted it clean. Then they went into my room. The specialist opened my closet and automatically looked up and saw the secondary attic door. We have a big door that leads to it and a small ladder in my room. He opens it and I'm right next to him. I promise on my life, seeing the pure darkness looking back at me was so intense. It felt like something was staring right at me. It felt like they were staring right at me. 2 guys go up there and come down a few minutes later. They said, "Yeah, they're up there." My first question was, why were they there? The specialist says, "They're here because God has big plans for you and your dad. They're here to try to prevent it." It felt relieving hearing that but I was still scared. We all got in a circle and began praying. Then they began retaliating. My stepmom was with us at the time, but she was like me for a long time. Didn't believe much of it until things happened to her. She had a place of her own, so she didn't stay the day that it all started. She usually stayed 2 or 3 times a week. Well, as we were praying, my dad said something so weird and negative, and my stepmom was upset with him, and they started really yelling at each other. Eventually, spit was flying everywhere. We had to make them go outside because the specialist knew what was going on. We started praying a lot and other things, and I asked a ton of questions to why he was using these things. For example, holy water and how it works. And he brought up good verses in the Bible showing why. He was a great guy. After a lot of praying, things started to die down. It took weeks to get things back to normal. My brother died a little over 2 years ago. I remember it vividly and at the same time forget everything. I hate hospitals, bright lights, and beeping noises now. I can't stand them. My brother was a long-time addict and was in jail often. Last time he was in jail, he came home and started to go through drug withdrawal, so things became a struggle for him. He wasn't using for a while, but then for some reason, I knew he started using again, but never told my mother because I didn't want to be a snitch. I assume he used a used needle that got him sick and his body rapidly grew weaker. The first hospital we went to was horrible to him. Then they moved him and then moved him again to different hospitals. He'd gotten a bacterial infection that spread to his heart and they couldn't do anything about it. I was there the day he was supposed to get surgery, but his body was too weak and we had to let him go. I was there in the room with my sister and mother. I held my brother's hand as they unplugged the machine and he passed away peacefully. After that, I wrote a letter to him and put it under his urn, and I talked to him through candles. There hasn't been any strong activity with him, so I guessed he was gone. I've only recently been accepting his death, but something odd happened a few nights ago. It was a dream, or nightmare. I'm not sure, but it was off-putting. I only remember the small part. I was walking into a grey room and saw my brother vividly, and I was so excited to see him alive again, and we talked for a while. Something weird started happening to him though. He started to have a mental breakdown and was crying and screaming. He curled up into a ball and I couldn't do anything. I just watched. It's been eating away at me, and I told my mom and she said the psychic she went to said spirits can visit us in our dreams. I'm not sure why my brother would do something like that though. Sure, to show me how hard it is to go through withdrawal, but why that way? It happened to a mother. We'll call her Maria, along with her family. They lived in rural Mexico, and everything was far away. So when they had to go and shop for groceries or supplies, it'd take them 2 days. Maria during the time was with her aunt, and she was 13. Maria's family had a farm containing 20 goats and sheep. They had 6 German Shepherd dogs, who Maria grew up with. The house is a very old one, with wall panels full with gaps and wooden circle holes. So when it's so cold, the house is also cold, and the same thing goes for hot. Maria, her aunt and her aunt's baby were minding their business during the night. Maria suddenly recognized the 6 German Shepherds all sat up staring at Maria. Horrified and shaken, Maria felt something was wrong. They couldn't be bad, since Maria knew them since they were puppies. The aunt agreed something was definitely wrong. They decided to hide for a bit just to be safe. The house had a storage attic that you can also see through the floor panels. They went up to hide. Maria decided to look through the floor panels, seeing the dogs had laid down in the same position, on their arms calmly, looking at one part of a wall. What Maria saw traumatized her for the rest of her life. She saw what seemed to be a human finger with a fingernail, but it wasn't human. The finger becomes longer and longer as it slides through one of the wall holes. It reached half of the room, pointing across the room from one side to the other. The dogs' heads were right below the finger. What felt like hours, Maria couldn't look away, until the baby suddenly got hungry and decided to cry. The finger quickly slid out of the hole. Maria and her aunt were beyond horrified, and they stayed at where they were till the next morning. Maria opened the door. She couldn't believe it. The goats and sheep were all gutted, violently killed, twisted necks with intestines out everywhere. The parents arrived later on during the night. Maria knew when her parents were home when she saw the car lights approaching from a far, dirty road. Maria explained everything that happened and what she saw. Her parents were relieved Maria was all healthy and all right. They later on grew their farm again, and they never saw this creature again. I picked up smoking in college to deal with stress. The ritual of it helped me to unwind and go outside, and I loved the nicotine buzz. I know it was stupid, and I knew it back then too. In retrospect, I think I was going through a somewhat self-destructive streak at the time, but I justified my behaviour to myself in all kinds of ways. Mainly, I'll trade a few days of my life for improved mental health. From this point forward, my story is pretty simple. Once I got to a pack a day, took me 2 or 3 months, my body was not happy about it. I had dreams which almost seemed like a direct communication from my subconscious mind, telling me to knock it off. I'd see the inside of my lungs and watch them fill up with sawdust. I could see cells bursting and corrupting. I watched black dust, tar, and other crap working its way into the microscopic pits and valleys of my internal organs. In general, I was burdened by a terrible, unwholesome feeling that followed me into the daytime. But if that was my body imploring me to stop, I didn't listen. Either it figured out a smarter strategy, or something higher stepped in to help. One day, I had a dream of a completely different nature. I wish I could recount all the details, but most of the memory has faded. I do know that right up until the end, it was a fairly normal dream, until I was suddenly confronted by a dream catcher, who felt a little different than the others. He'd been off in my peripheral vision until he turned to look me directly in the eyes and said something. Boy, do I wish I could remember what he said, but it sounded like pure gibberish at the time. After that, I immediately woke up, and that gibberish was still fresh on my mind. I didn't think it was a real language, but it seemed to have some meaning to it. So just in case, and while I was still groggy, I picked up my phone and typed those words into Google Translate. Best way I could think to spell them. Translation, don't smoke. Well, that woke me right up, and it spooked me a little too. I've studied 2 languages in my life, Japanese and Spanish. This was neither, and I don't remember how Google identifies it. Arabic, Polynesian or something. Personally, I don't think it was a real language at all. Google will translate nonsense into seemingly meaningful statements, and it just so happens that my dream character knew the precise gibberish I needed for a kick in the butt. It worked. I stopped smoking, and I'm never starting back. I'm only 15, and haven't had any really scary things happen to me. So I asked my dad for some of his scary stories to share. Dad had quite a few, but several happened in one area he lived in as a child. When I asked him everything that happened there, he had quite a few things to tell me. He also talked to my uncle and my grandparents to get what they remembered about the place too. What you're about to hear is everything that my dad, uncle, and grandparents remember about the few years they spent there. My grandfather joined the Navy when my dad was born. After going from Tennessee to Florida to Rhode Island, they were transferred to Maine in the late 1970s. My grandfather was in a special aerial quick response squadron that took its orders from the Joint Chief of Staff and operated out of Naval Air Station in Brunswick, Maine, NASB. They were formed during the Cold War and a scrapbook my grandfather has is full of pictures of close encounters with Russian subs, battleships, and bombers. My family lived on base housing in Brunswick, which was pretty cramped, so my grandparents decided to purchase a home. My grandparents bought a house in Lisbon Falls, which was about a 25-minute drive from NASB. Lisbon Falls is a small town, and my grandparents bought a home in an area known as Lisbon Centre, which was, as you might have guessed, in the centre of Lisbon Falls. This was 1980, and my dad was about 9 when they moved there. You probably haven't heard of Lisbon Falls. When my family was there, they had maybe 2 or 3 traffic lights in the whole town. My dad's graduating high school class only had 100 kids in it. The nearest McDonald's or fast food place was a 20-minute drive away, and the nearest mall was a 30-minute drive. They had 2 small grocery stores, one of which was heated by a wood stove in the winter. Some kids drove snowmobiles to school when there's snow on the ground. The only claim to fame that Lisbon Falls had, besides being home to Moxie Festival — Moxie is a pretty nasty tasting soda, in case you didn't know, every year — was that Stephen King went to high school here. When my dad got to high school, his English teacher was also a teacher of Stephen King's, and my dad's social studies teacher was the basis for a character in King's book Stand By Me. The restaurant my dad and uncle worked at was visited by a movie production crew. They took pictures and video of it to use as a model for the restaurant they made for the Stephen King movie The Graveyard Shift. Aside from Moxie and King, there was really nothing remarkable about the small main town. The house my grandparents bought was on a dead-end street. On one side of the street, there was their house and the neighbours. Across the street was a big paper mill, and at the end of the street was a river, just 2 houses and a paper mill. The paper mill has since been torn down. All that remains are a few portions of the wall, and that's mostly seen via Google Earth. But when my dad lived there, it was a fully functioning paper mill. Behind the paper mill, down a creepy dirt road, was an abandoned chicken farm, which had been torn down as well. My dad and uncle only ever got within a couple 100 feet of it, not daring to go any closer. As they became teens, with them and their friends looking for places away from the prying eyes of parents and police to sneak a cigarette or a beer, they never once thought about going down that creepy dirt road to the chicken farm. After growing up, they don't ever recall anyone they knew who wanted to talk about it, let alone ever go there. It was a place no one mentioned, ever, despite being the perfect hideaway to do the things you didn't want your parents to see. Everyone avoided it. My dad said he believed this part of Lisbon Centre was cursed. My dad was in the driveway early one evening. A silver car stopped in front of the house. A man with black hair was staring at him with an angry look on his face. My dad said that in his entire life, he's only experienced intense hatred once, and it was from that man's eyes as he stared at him. My dad was frozen. The man stared for a couple of minutes before opening his car door. The man got out, never taking his eyes off of my dad. The man got to the trunk of his car when my grandmother stuck her head out of the side door to call my dad in for dinner. The stranger jumped back in his car and sped away, in reverse up the street. When my dad got to high school, he swore one of his teachers looked identical to the man in the car years earlier. I think it might have been. One day, my dad and uncle were playing in the yard. My grandmother came running around from the front of the house, screaming for my dad and uncle to get in the car. My grandmother flew out of the driveway and away from the house. Later that day, my dad and uncle asked why they left. My grandmother was working in the front yard when a man stopped at the end of the street and started yelling. A woman came out of the mill. The man went to his car, grabbed a gun, and shot her. After my family sped away, the man shot the woman's supervisor and then himself. A bridge ran alongside the western edge of the mill. A boy drowned there while trying to swim. The side of my family's house had a window over the kitchen sink that faced the driveway. My grandmother would occasionally see a figure standing outside in the driveway, but not of a person, just a shadowy outline of a person. All of my family members would see shadow figures in the house, shadows of people. They'd be seen on the walls just standing still or quickly moving between rooms. My dad would hear people talking when there was no one else in the house. He'd hear muffled conversations like people were talking in a different room, but no one would ever be there when he'd go to check it out. But he'd still hear the talking even when going between rooms. The most active place was upstairs. The upstairs of the house had 2 bedrooms, my dad's and my uncle's. When you hit the top of the stairs, to the right was my uncle's room, straight ahead was my dad's room, and to the left was a weird storage space. There was no door on the storage space. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a small bathroom, but it had sloped ceilings, so you couldn't even stand up straight in it. To store or move anything in that space, you had to do so on your knees. My uncle's bed was by his door. He'd see people going in and out of that storage space all night. They were always quiet. They'd crawl out, stand up, and leave. Then when going back in, they'd kneel and crawl into it out of view. My dad's bed was at the far end of his room. He'd constantly hear footsteps staring at his bedroom door and walking towards his bed. This happened so much that my dad would start sleeping with pillows stacked on his chest in case someone ever appeared and tried to hurt him. The only neighbours on the street were 2 old men that lived next door. My grandfather happened to be talking to one of them one day and mentioned some of the things that had been happening. The old man told him that something horrible happened in the upstairs of my family's house. Something absolutely horrible, and the old man was positive that my family's home was haunted. The old man refused to say what happened, just that it was very bad. My family said that the neighbour, whom my dad and uncle called Old Man Harry, died not long after that, so they were never able to tell him what happened. My family only stayed there a few years in total before moving to a different area of Lisbon Falls. My dad did tell me that even after he got his driver's license in high school, that he never went down that dead-end street again. I'll start off by saying I was studying abroad in England back in the fall of 2017, and my friends and I went to Edinburgh for a weekend trip just to explore and sightsee. One of my friends looked online and we found out that 1, Edinburgh was very haunted, and 2, they had ghost tours. So we picked one that was the cheapest. We were on a college budget. It started off pretty chill. The tour was super nice and friendly. Walked around above ground, saw where the longest hanging took place in Edinburgh and other haunted places. But then we learned there were catacombs or vaults in certain places, and the tour would take us into one. I never knew Edinburgh had catacombs, so I was shook, but excited. I can't remember the exact place where we went to, but we climbed down the steps and into a giant, almost cavern-looking place. It was very dark with some lanterns, creepy as hell environment, and our tour guide explained how people have seen different ghosts, and how most are friendly, but one is extremely mean and terrible. She said people have actually screamed and ran out of there. None of that happened to me or friends on this tour, but the entire time we were down there, I remember the back of my neck got really cold, like winter level of cold. And when we went out, the parts where people saw the particular mean spirit or spectre, I felt like I needed to get out, like very bad vibes. I didn't though, and just stayed in the middle of the group and took deep breaths. And eventually, we left and I felt better. When we got out, we talked about the experience, and one of my friends, Nick, who was on the far edge of the group against the wall, felt worse than me. He felt his entire body get cold and started shivering. He said at one point he felt someone grab his hand in the room where people saw the evil spectre and thought he heard whispering. We were the only 2 to actually get affected during the ghost tour among our friends.